Refraction Railway 4 came out about a week ago and is certainly a unique addition compared to the previous iterations. The main gimmick of Railway 4 comes from a specific enemy type that had been distinctly missing from the game until now, namely the NV Pecatulum. These beings embrace their role's namesake by stealing the identities of whomever they happen to be fighting. These enemies, while they are certainly unique and provide a much different challenge than what we are used to, are not really that threatening, all things considered, and make the railway much easier as a result. The presence of the NV Pecatulum have very significant consequences to the actual difficulty of the railway, and they do this in two very distinct ways. First, their existence restricts the actual presence of real boss fights, with there only being around 4 real bosses unlike the previous railway's 7 to 8. And by real boss, I'm referring to any fight where there is a single character with over 1000 HP and who is typically alone. The second is actually a byproduct of the first. By having less actual bosses, the collective total HP pool of the entire railway is significantly less than any of the previous iterations, resulting in the minimum turn count being significantly lower. This makes the railway a lot more lenient when it comes to achieving a low turn count. Even without playing very optimally, you can still get a decent time so long as you have a few good egos at your disposal. The only real challenge is that by nature of the fights being back-to-back, you will have to live with any minor mistake you happen to make along the way. But even with that, as you will soon come to learn, it doesn't really prevent you from achieving a good time. The first section of this railway consists of 3 different fights. First is the Portrait of a Certain Day, followed by the Dregs of the Manor, and lastly, Nelly. The best team to use to get through this is one which needs to be good at both dealing with bosses and mob fights, which is actually very few of them, to be honest. Bleed, Rupture, and Sinking are only really good against bosses, so while they are certainly usable, they are not very good at getting low turns here. Poise is the exact opposite, which leaves only Burn and Tremor. Tremor is better into the actual bosses than Burn, but Burn is good at both of them, which is the reason I chose to use it. If you prefer to use Tremor, you certainly can, and would likely get a similar result, if not slightly better. In my opinion, there are currently only 4 usable Burn units in the game. Liu Ishmael and Rodion, as well as both Walpurgis Noct identities, Philip Sinclair and Magic Bullet Otis. Certainly an exclusive team to be sure, but that's the price you need to pay to get a low turn count in the Refraction Railway. Even for Tremor, you'd still need Regret Faust, who's the same level of exclusivity. Liu Ryoshu is technically another usable Burn unit, but even if we wanted to use her, we can't, because instead we need to run Maid Ryoshu, as she's absolutely invaluable against the butlers. I chose to run Pequot Heathcliff as well, as I had been planning on using his Binds ego during the Dregs fight, but that never actually happened because the only source of gloom I had was on Sinclair, and I couldn't fuel it in any reasonable amount of time as a result. A much better choice over him would have been Ring Yi Song, as he's just a very powerful identity in general and technically a Burn unit, as well as also possessing the Gloom skill that's really necessary for this run. The backup mechanic introduced for this railway is certainly an interesting addition, but ultimately it's not very viable to actually take advantage of it. There are very few teams where there are 7+ usable identities, so losing one of your main team members just for a small boost to your ego resources is generally not worth it. It's more of a, hey, here's some compensation for getting incredibly unlucky so it's not an instant reset than anything you should actually be taking advantage of. As such, they are relegated to being exclusively support passives, and honestly, they don't matter that much apart from N. Faust, who's really needed to keep Sinclair in his ego form for long enough. Aside from that, the only other necessity is to make sure Sinclair is deployed second to give him the extra sanity regeneration, and Maid Ryoshu is 5th to give her extra speed. The first fight in the railway is against the Portrait of a Certain Day. He's a pretty basic and easy boss, all things considered. The main difficulty from him comes from the fact that he's the first boss, and as such you're reliant on RNG to gain any sanity. Burn's slow ramp time also makes this fight take longer than it should, thanks to Otis being stuck at 1 to 3 Dark Flame for the entire fight. This is probably why Tremor is the better option for your team, as they're a burst option, as opposed to a slow damage over time that Burn has. Hopefully by the time you hit the Portrait's HP threshold to change his attack pattern, you'll have gained enough sanity to not have to worry about clashes anymore. It's pretty straightforward what to do at this point. Clash with all of his skills to reveal which portrait is the real one, indicated by it using a guard skill. Then make sure you defeat it that turn to remove all of the protection on the boss. Once you've done that, it's super easy to stagger the guy and then finish him off the next turn. Total turns for this fight, 7. Pretty slow, all things considered. Tremor could have shaved off an extra turn or two, but so could have Ringy Song, so I'm not really that upset about it. The second fight is against the Dregs of the Manor. This is the reason why we brought Maid Ryoshu. Having the single most consistent base AoE skill, as well as it being slash damage, she easily is capable of defeating 50% of this wave by herself. A lot of this wave relies on abusing the 2 AoE users in Ryoshu and Sinclair, as well as using whatever AoE egos you actually can. The name of the game is to spread the damage as quickly as possible and reveal Josephine as early as you can. She doesn't spawn until all of the original 6 butlers are defeated, where she will come out guarded by 2 blunt, weak butlers. It's very important to not actually defeat these butlers too early, as once you defeat one of them, Hindley will spawn, forcing you to face down 8 to 10 skill slots. Focus down Josephine as much as possible. Obviously clash with the other butlers, but don't actually try and defeat them until you take out most of her health. Bringing her down to half health is more than enough, as you can stagger her and focus down Hindley at the same time. This is one of the times where Burn is the best status. Because of its slow ticking, you can easily focus multiple threats at the same time, and not worry about stacking up the status too much. This is also where I make my first big mistake by targeting too many attacks into Josephine. I kill her, resulting in Heathcliff's attack being wasted. This might not seem like that big of a deal, but once Hindley is the only one left and we can focus 100% on him, he's left with only 24 HP, which if I targeted Heathcliff's skill into him instead, would have saved me an extra turn. Of course, I also missed more than my fair share of coin rolls, which if any of them connected, I likely would have done enough damage as well.
조금씩 나아가고 있네요. 전투응대에 나서.
제 상태가 좋지 않아 보여.
놀라운 명령이네요. 적을 완벽히 파악하고 있으신 거군요.
적합한 관리법이었어요. 다행이에요.
당신의 판단을 따를게요.
The final station for the first section is against Nelly. Just like with the portrait, a fairly easy boss. Unlike him, however, she is actually even easier. Reason being, with her so deep into the fight, Otis is stacked up fairly high and can inflict a ton of Dark Flame instantly, giving us a massive necessary damage spike to beat her quickly. As long as you clash with all of Nelly's skills and ensure your whole team isn't inflicted with Butler's mark, you should have no problem beating her no matter what team you're using. Unfortunately, I make yet another mistake which cost me another turn at least. You see, I couldn't actually clash with all of her skills as her speed rolled too high one turn, or I should say I rolled too low. This meant certain characters were going to be hit by her no matter what, as I also lacked the damage to stagger her in time. The only one of any significance who would be taking damage is Sinclair, as it would end up staggering. I recognized this, but didn't pay it any mind, as I could activate Faust's passive and push him to manifest his ego, which in turn would negate the stagger. I, however, failed to notice he had a massive sinking stack of 25, which immediately upon being hit knocked him back down below the threshold, and resulted in him getting staggered anyways. Absolute disaster, as I missed out on using his skill 3 against a staggered Nelly and doing an absolute metric ton of damage, which certainly cost me a turn. All in all, a very scuffed first section, not optimized in the slightest, yet still my best run with 20 turns. I could have easily shaved off an extra 2, 3, or maybe even 4 turns by simply playing better and using Ringy's song instead of Pequod Heathcliff. I don't know if Tremor is the better choice here, as I haven't actually used it, but I would guess that it's at least equal to Burn, if not better. It ultimately comes down to how well Tremor does in the Dregs fight, but either one should work. The second section is the first time we encounter the Envy Pekatula, taking on the form of both N-Corp and the Blade lineage. June is here too, I guess, and honestly, he's a bigger threat than the Pekatulam ever could be. At least these ones anyways. You see, despite how threatening an 8-speed self-destructive purge can be, the Pekatulam all have the same weakness. They're all fairly squishy. Being direct one-to-one copies of our own identities, that's certainly saying something, but makes dealing with them incredibly simple. All you need to do is figure out what damage type they're mostly weak to, and just use a few high attack weight egos of that damage type. For N-Corp, most of them are fatal to blunt damage with a few slash, and the Blade lineage are fatal to blunt and pierce. The best team to deal with are identities that have a lot of AoE, and those damage types. The first and most important member is either Rabbit or Pequod Heathcliff, as both of them have pierce damage, but more importantly give you access to the Binds ego, which is absolutely required. Next is both Maid Ryoshu again, as well as Bamboo Hatted Mersault, as they have slash damage, which is very good in the Jun fight, but also have incredibly powerful AoE skills. Regret Faust also has a reliable AoE blunt skill, and both Ringy Song and Captain Ishmael have powerful pierce attacks. Support passives again don't really matter as long as you choose as many damage modifiers as possible. The first fight against N-Corp is relatively straightforward. Clash with as many skills as you have to, and try to use binds as quickly as possible. A single use of it, as long as it rolls heads, is enough to stagger over half of them instantly. If you get a little lucky with your rolls, or are capable of also using Blind Obsession or Sun Shower, you might even have enough damage to defeat N-Corp in a single turn. As long as your math isn't completely awful and you don't waste any attacks, you can easily beat them in 2 turns, as Binds turning Heathcliff's skills AoE makes it even easier to finish off any enemy you couldn't normally.
속에서 움직일 수 있는
황금이 이렇게
깨어져라.
뛰어보라고.
황금이
씹는 맛이 있는데.
선원들,
와,
나를
성공했어.
보호해라.
보여? 개체가 더
Next up is the June fight, and I'll be honest, this team is not really designed to beat him quickly.
총원 불경.
They're really good against regular enemies, but are simply not the best when it comes to actual boss encounters. Jun's health pool being as large as it is certainly makes this fight take longer than it should. But even with that, they're not the worst, as they are able to defeat his minions before he even has a chance to attack. The scariest thing about him is definitely his counter, but being able to defeat every other enemy before he even shows up certainly makes him a lot easier to deal with. There's not really a whole lot of strategy in this fight to begin with. Simply use whatever AoE skills you can and make sure that the first person attacking Jun isn't weak to envy or slash damage. You should be able to get through this fight in at least 5 to 6 turns, which while kind of slow isn't the worst thing in the world.
이 작살, 필살의 집념이 담겨 있지. 보았나? 적은 이렇게 진리가
부위 하나가 파괴되었어. 이대로 똑같이 한다면 모든 부위를 파괴시킬 수 있겠지? 방금 공격은 좋았어. 이대로만 계속해보면 좋을 텐데.
제압 완료.
쨍그랑 부위가 조각났어.
총원 불경.
1타입이 맞지? 카론 식단해줄게.
저놈을 추적해. 사냥이 성공적이었네요. 총원 불경. 나를 보호해라. 탈출 개체 확인. 나를 보호해라.
여러분은 하실 수 있을 거예요.
탈출 개체 확인. 부위 파괴. 독대를 부러뜨리는 것만큼 중요한 한 방이었어요.
Once we get to the Blade lineage, it's a very similar strategy to N-Corp. Use Binds as half of them are weak to blunt damage, and Blind Obsession if you can, since the other half of them are weak to Pierce. Other than that, just don't clash with the enemy Mersault to yield my flesh while simultaneously using your own to decimate the enemy team. Binds is absolutely invaluable for this run. Essentially giving Heathcliff AoE for 2 turns, it cannot be understated how necessary it is to get a good time on any of the Pecatulum fights.
어떻게 하신 거죠? 깜짝 놀랐어요. 아까 했던 공격 덕에
이 작살이 필살의 심령이 담겨있지.
씹는 맛이 있는데.
탈출 배치가 종료되었습니다.
The third section is one where I'm not entirely sure what the most optimal strategy truly is. It starts with a long drawn-out fight against more enemy Pekatulam, followed by the Dreaming Electric Sheep, who has one of the single largest health pools in the entire game, sitting at over 3,000. I may not know which one is the best, but I do know the only viable options for this fight are either Tremor or Rupture, as they're the only ones capable of doing that much damage in any reasonable amount of time. So, because I'm not quite used to using Tremor just yet, I went with my comfort pick and used Rupture instead. I would argue that Rupture is slightly more difficult to use in this fight, simply because the sheep is the second encounter, and so one of your identities will be a deadweight for most of the first half. That identity is the most important for Rupture teams, Talisman Sinclair, who spends most of his time doing absolutely nothing, trying to preserve his talisman stack as long as possible. The other members are the necessary 7 Heathcliff, Faust and Otis, as well as Lantern Dawn and LCCB Ishmael. For most of this run, I was actually using Rosespanner Gregor over Ishmael, but he just wasn't working, so I swapped him out, and the second I did, then I managed to get a decent time. The deployment order only matters for 2 identities, those being Sinclair, who needs the extra speed, so he's more likely to move first when inflicting Talisman against the sheep, and Otis, who needs the extra sanity. Well, not necessarily Otis, but whichever character you'll be spamming egos with. So either her, Ishmael, or Heathcliff. The best way to get through this fight is by using Heathcliff's binds, as just like with the previous Pekatulam fight, most of them are weak to blunt damage. Unfortunately for me, I did not actually have enough Gloom resources to fuel it, and had to resort to the weaker Otis's version of binds instead. This of course wouldn't be a problem if you had used Ring Yi Song in the first section, as his Gloom skill would have been more than enough to use as many binds as you'd like. And that's the main reason why this fight took so long for me. A severe lack of Gloom resources meant I was heavily restricted by what egos I could actually use. The best were Otis's binds, as it didn't cost Gloom, and Ishmael's Blind Obsession, because it's a fairly powerful AoE skill which I could actually fuel in a reasonable amount of time. The best advice I can give for this fight is to just have enough Gloom resources to spam at least 2 high attack weight egos every turn. Also, don't be afraid to use Durante in this fight. It's probably the best time to use it if you have to. You should be able to win in at most 5 turns if you do.
저 부표처럼 흔들리는 놈이 직접 나서서 관찰은 끝났습니다. 승리를 위해서
방금 했던 공격은 매우 효과적이었어. 하지만 아직 부족해. 다음 공격은 더 잘할 수 있도록. 조금씩 나아가고 있네요.
깔끔하게. 놀라운 명령은 표적 무력화. 적을 완벽히 파악하고 있으신 거군요. 표적 완전 무력화. 사냥이 성공적이었네요.
잘근잘근 씹어버리겠네.
승리를 위해서
무엇 잘못했는지 아는 것부터가 시작이 됐어.
당신을 인도해주지 못해 따뜻하게 안아줄 수는 있어요.
적합한 관리법이었어요. 다행이에요.
그대로 멈춰라. 쓰러져.
와, 성공했어.
For the sheep itself, it's typical rupture stuff. Although this time it takes a turn less than it would normally, as Sinclair should have enough talisman going in to inflict it instantly. As long as you keep the stack alive, he should die in no more than 4 turns. In the most optimal setting, this section should only take you around 6 to 8 turns. Something that I definitely did not achieve.
확인 사살.
방금 건 제대로 된 공격이 아니었는데.
교전 시작합니다.
제가 도움이 될지는 모르겠지만 잘근잘근 씹어버리겠네.
그대로
적들이 흔들흔들.
그대로 멈춰라.
쨍그랑 부위가 조각났어. 계속해도 돼.
표적 완전 무력화.
And that brings us to the final section of the railway against the King in Binds, and honestly the easiest section in the entire railway as well. Just like every one of us, the King has an affinity for a specific status effect, that being sinking. Now the actual status effect itself isn't that big of a deal. The only thing that matters is a byproduct of using exclusively sinking identities, and that is that 90% of them are fatal to pierce damage. With there being a total of 3 7 attack weight pierce egos in the game, it's very easy to assume what the initial strategy of this fight is. Just like before, you have the same 2 choices of teams, Tremor or Rupture. For either one, you'll want to use both LCCB Ishmael and Ringy Song as they possess the aforementioned egos, as well as being both Tremor and Rupture identities, depending on Ring's RNG. Other than that, the Rupture team at least is the same as before. For the start of the fight, picking the Wrath Mask is virtually required, if you're trying to beat the fight as quickly as possible. Picking anything else is a fool's errand no matter what team you're using, as sacrificing the 10% bonus damage is absolutely stupid. It's not a bad thing to do it if you're not going for a low time, but the other options are just not nearly as good. All you need to do is use 2 of the Pierce Egos every turn, and you'll be more than capable of finishing the first half in around 4 to 5 turns. The only reason this fight took me longer than that was because I took a gamble as to whether Otis or the enemy Heathcliff would move first when they speed tied, and got it wrong, resulting in him using binds and staggering my whole team. Ultimately, this didn't matter much, but it did cost an extra turn as I didn't have enough damage to finish off the final enemy, Sinclair.
직접 나서지.
합격장. 그원의 접근.
총원, 조명이 전멸하는 저곳. 바로 모든 것을 쳐부술 거다.
칼날이 잘 드네요. 아마 그 공격이 약점이었겠죠? 부서지는 홍차입 같군요.
승리를 위해서라면
와, 방금 너무 근사한 이력이었는데? 관리자님
직접 나서지. 지겹고 이 몸에 직접 뽑아야겠네.
당신을 인도해주진 못해도 따뜻하게 안아줄 수는 있어. 한 번에 이렇게나 맞지?
교전 시작합니다.
부서진 홍차입 같군요.
이제야 완성되었나?
After that, the king himself is ultimately the same as the sheep. Pick the Wrath Mask again because duh, and then let Rupture do Rupture things. I could have defeated him a turn earlier if not for the fact that I managed to kill the Rupture stack early thanks to forgetting to use Dimension Shredder on the previous fights, which would have turned Yi Song into an actual Rupture identity. As long as you manage to use Dimension Shredder before the king shows up, you shouldn't be able to kill the stack and can probably beat him in 2 turns. Speaking of Yi Song, if you get a little lucky, he has literally the highest Rupture count application out of any identity, so simply because he has Dimension Shredder, which keeps all of his attacks at least neutral, he is probably one of the best Rupture identities out of them all.
색색이 환하고 나의 기억 못하게 하는 길이군요.
받은 사살.
나만 믿고 바디에 집중해줘. 도움이 될 수 있을 거야.
좀 찍어버려.
물론 너는 적을 완벽히 파악하고 있으신 거군요. 이 전투는 승리. 적합한 관리법이었어요. 이제는 내 것만
좀 찍어버려.
예측대로.
그 객체는 다른 방법으로 이 하나가 떨어졌네요. 이제 좀 수월해지겠어요. 더 이상 얻을 정보는 없군요.
전투 응대는 성공적이었다. 나쁘지 않은 움직임이었어. 이제 다른 쪽 집안일로 돌아가지.
And that's essentially how to beat Refraction Railway 4 in 50 turns or less. This run was incredibly scuffed and not optimized in the slightest. There were more than a handful of times where I made a minor mistake which cost me a turn or two. I could have at least brought it down to 45 by simply playing better, but in my opinion a perfect 5-0 looks better on the banner no matter how scuffed the actual run for it was. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped in any way, give the video a like, and maybe even consider subscribing. Goodbye!